thanks very much. It's very good to see the three of you. Kathryn Stone, Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards. Do you want to say just a couple of brief words at the beginning? And you might, in the process, introduce James and Helen.
I do. Very, very happy to do that. I think the challenge at this point in a list of witnesses is that everything's been said already and said very eloquently and powerfully. I hope that we can add some useful perspective. Anyway, let's give it a go. Thank you for inviting us to give evidence to your inquiry into the Code of Conduct. James Davis is the Registrar of Members' Financial Interests, has been in the House for a very, very long time, serving as a clerk in the House. Helen Reid is the Senior Complaints and Investigations Manager, comes with a huge amount of knowledge, skill and experience of investigations in other places. Much of my work and the advice that the office gives is carried out in private. Interestingly, we were just talking about that, including the advice that I give to this committee. That confidentiality is key to the work of my office. However, it does make a wider understanding of the role of Commissioner in relation to the Code of Conduct more difficult. For that reason, we really welcome the opportunity to talk to you today about our work and about the Code. The system of promoting and maintaining parliamentary standards and associated rules is a very crowded space. The Speaker, the Committee on Standards, the Code of Conduct, the Ministerial Code, the Independent Advisor on Ministerial Interests, the Committee on Standards in Public Life, the Electoral Commission, the Registrar of Consultant Lobbyists, the Lords Commissioners, the Lords Conduct Committee, the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority, the Independent Complaints and Grievance Scheme, the Independent Expert Panel, the Advisory Committee on Business Interests, the Administration Committee, and the Office of the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards. They're all really important systems and processes, and the number of them results in an understandable level of confusion. And it was interesting to me yesterday, Professor Hayward talked about more and more bodies haven't necessarily led to improved standards in public life. The values of my office are independent, impartial, thorough and fair. And we take each of these very seriously. They are the benchmarks by which we measure our work and the work of the office. And the work of the office, as you know, is to keep the registers, to advise MPs in this committee, and perhaps the most well-known aspect of my work is to investigate allegations of breaches of the Code of Conduct. And it does not extend, as many people think, to the Ministerial Code or to alleged failures to uphold the Nolan principles. The Code of Conduct and the Guide to the Rules is a valuable part of ensuring trust and transparency in our parliamentary democracy. It could be better. If members of Parliament and members of the public are to have confidence in it, it has to be clear enough for everyone to understand. And I hope that during this session we can offer you some suggestions on how to bring greater clarity. We're very happy to take your questions, easy ones only to me, more difficult ones to my colleagues.
All right, so start at 10. How are standards going in Britain at the moment?
We get an awful lot of letters from members of the public who are very, very frustrated. And what we've heard from members and witnesses so far rings absolutely true with me. Members of the public are really angry. They're really angry about the ways in which they see members of Parliament exploiting opportunities to make additional money. There is no prohibition on that, but members of the public are very angry about that. They're very angry about what they see as conflicts of interest, that members of Parliament, or their perception of conflicts of interest. Members of the public are also concerned that members of Parliament get away with things. And they express real frustration about, for example, the amount of time that members have been suspended for, or the days on which the suspension has to be served. So I think it's a really challenging time, and it's been really challenging for the office to maintain the amount of responses that we give to members of the public. On the other hand, if I might add, that we have been really moved and supported by the number of letters, cards, emails and so on that we've had from members of the public, thanking the office, thanking the team for doing our job in the light of recent scandals, and that's been a real boost to members of the team.
It sounded a bit as if you were saying that the public is angry about lots of things that you can't investigate or don't investigate and can't do anything about.
I think that's part of the conversation about the code of conduct, isn't it? It's one of the things that springs to mind is the challenge about the Ministerial code, as I said in my opening remarks. And members of the public quite reasonably simply cannot understand why a backbench member of Parliament is subject to greater degree of scrutiny and requirement to register things like gifts and hospitality than a minister is. And I know, Chair, that you gave an example, I think it was yesterday, of a minister who had told us that they would register their attendance at an event in the Ministerial register, and several months later it still hasn't appeared. And members of the public see that as not being transparent, not being open, not promoting the Nolan principles, and they want to see a clarity around that.
Okay. Alan.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Commissioner. I'm sure the committee will join me in thanking you and your team for your hard work and dedication in what are always difficult and challenging cases to be investigated, and your obvious commitment to improving standards in the House on behalf of the Parliament and the public, and I'm sure it is greatly appreciated by all.
Thank you.
Commissioner, in your review of the Code, you drew a distinction between what is investigatable and what is not. As you know, we are proposing to keep the principles from being investigatable. Can you explain for the record this distinction between what is investigatable and what isn't, and what makes something appropriate for investigation?
Thank you. I'm very happy to do that, and can I thank you for your kind words at the beginning of your question. We do receive a significant number of complaints about why we're not investigating breaches of the Nolan principles. And rules must be based on investigable actions rather than the principles of good behaviour. Sir Bernard spoke yesterday about the written evidence submitted by Claire Foster Gilbert of the Westminster Abbey Institute. And I would like to quote from her written evidence. And she said that the principles, the Nolan principles, are a moral compass for all of us in public life. Those principles are aspirational values which inform the rules of conduct. And the rules and the guide to the rules give us things to test. They're the hard edges that we can investigate. And again, referring back to the Chair yesterday in Lord Evans' evidence, he talked about how would you investigate an allegation of a breach of the principle of selflessness. Is somebody too selfless, or have they not been selfless enough, or objective enough or not? So the guide to the rules gives us things to test. Were the gifts and hospitality registered within 28 days? Yes or no? Was the declaration made? Yes or no? What would really help, in our view, is a change to the structure which clearly separates out what can and what can't be investigated. And I'd also like to pick up on something else that Sir Bernard has referred to previously, and again is contained in Claire Foster Gilbert's evidence, that the Code of Conduct shouldn't just be a guidebook to wrap MPs' knuckles, but a wise and constructive guide to sustain their public service. And I think we would also like to see some educative and informative aspects to the elements of the Code and the Guide. So I support the view, and that of this committee, that the Code of Conduct and the Guide should be educative, should be informative for MPs, and equally importantly for members of the public, so they can understand what it is that members are expected to do.
Okay. Thanks. Jane.
I'd be interested to know in what you're saying there, Commissioner. Are there things that you currently cannot investigate that you would want to have the opportunity to investigate?
You ask a really interesting question, and you perhaps are thinking about something that we might come on to talk about, unreasonable, excessive and personal attacks on social media and in other media. And I'm happy to go to that now, if that would be...
Feel free.
If that would be helpful. Okay. So the Code of Conduct predates the use of social media. It predates the existence of social media. And examples have been given by Mr. Carter of members of Parliament whose allegations are made about them which then hit 1 million people and have a very serious negative impact on that Member of Parliament. And I do know the Member of Parliament and spent some time speaking with them about it. And I'm in no doubt that it was a very difficult experience. I think it's really important, first of all, to acknowledge that members of Parliament are also subject to some terrifying personal attacks on social media. Jess Phillips talked about the death threats that she's had. Other members have had really dreadful threats made to them. And I'm also mindful of the murders of 2 members of Parliament and the imprisonment of individuals who have subjected members of Parliament to threats and very serious intimidation. Thankfully, we've got a really good security team in Parliament and a really good relationship with the Metropolitan Police Liaison team. I'm also mindful of the importance of freedom of speech and the fact that members of Parliament are elected to express their views and opinions. However, freedom of speech is a qualified right, and we have laws which prohibit incitement, hatred, and so on, and we spoke about that a little bit earlier. In my view, it's absolutely not necessary for an MP to subject anyone to an unreasonable, excessive, or personal attack to make their point. It's not necessary. And I know that there was some disquiet recently about the introduction of this as a rule. There are 3 limbs to this test: unreasonable, excessive, and personal. And the Senedd introduced this rule last year in Wales. They have this rule in Northern Ireland. We could set out guidance to stop allegations of subjectivity, and indeed, Chair, you used an example yesterday during Mr Costa's evidence about tumble dryers. You set out an example of where a comment could be excessive, reasonable and personal.
Hard of hearing. Hard of hearing,
that was the one, yeah. So I think it would be useful for the committee to note that I have already, with your support, given words of advice to members of Parliament about the use of social media, and that has been very well received. And for legal enthusiasts, there is a case, Sanders versus Kingston in the High Court in 2005, which concluded that a personal attack can never be a political opinion. So to go back to your question, Mrs. Burgess, it would be so helpful if we had the opportunity to consider the investigation of unreasonable, personal and excessive attacks. And members of the public are sadly subjected to this by members of Parliament and by other public officials that we have no jurisdiction over. And it would be very useful to be able to have that as an opportunity to use. At the moment, we can't investigate posts on social media unless there is a further breach of the rules, for example, bringing the House into disrepute, and that sets a very high bar. This would need to be a very high bar, as the Chair has already set out, because what we don't want to become is the Twitter police or the social media police. We would have to adopt a proportionate approach to it, but that would certainly be something.
We're going to have to get a bit shorter with answers because we've got quite a lot of things to cover,
okay, sorry.
I'm afraid. Andy?
To be honest, I think Jane has pretty much asked most of my questions, but I've got one just slightly... I want to come back to something that you said earlier. I think you listed 12 or 13 bodies that are involved in standards issues when you started, and you made reference to Professor Hayward's comments yesterday about more and more bodies not resulting in better standards. What's the answer? What is... If you could start again with the standards regime, what are the 2 or 3 basic things that you think we need to do? Looking at all of the standards, I agree, I think it's incredibly complicated. I've made the point several times. I think members of Parliament have many, many different areas to consider, and you can very quickly not look at the right book and find the wrong answer. What do you think we need to do?
I think it was Peter Ustinov who, when asked for direction, said you wouldn't start from here. And I think you wouldn't start from here. If you were to go back to a completely blank sheet of paper, you would want real clarity about which organisations are responsible for what part of which code. And when I think about the confusion that exists over the use of stationery, for example, this is very, very simple. It's a piece of paper or an envelope. There is real confusion amongst members of Parliament about what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. And one of you, forgive me, I've forgotten which one, said that people do trip up over very, very simple things. So the things that we have control over in this parliamentary space, I would like to see real clarity about responsibility. And I hope that the Code of Conduct will be able to set out the clarity of responsibilities, even if it's in an appendix or even at the front of the code that says these are the organisations that deal with these things, and that would really help members of Parliament, and it would be a huge benefit to members of the public.
Paul, I think you...
Very, very quickly, we're talking about unreasonable excessive personal attacks. You talked about 3 limbs. Isn't there a 4th, which could lead to endangerment or create an atmosphere of danger to an MP? What do you think about? I mean, that could. Do you think that could be judgeable?
I think we already have legislation about incitement, incitement to violence, incitement to racial hatred, and we would have to think carefully about the crossover and where there was a line between the two. But it's certainly something that we could consider, and I'd be very, very happy to discuss that with the committee about how we can make sure that that works without there being accusations of subjectivity or bias in the application of it.
Can I take you to the question of ministerial capacity? So one of the things that one of the sets of exemptions that we have in several different categories of the registration is that you don't have to declare something with the House if you received it in your ministerial capacity. Now, as I understand it, that's the reason, for instance, that you didn't feel able to investigate, for want of a better term, Wallpapergate, because the Prime Minister's flat is obviously received in his ministerial capacity as Prime Minister. Is that right?
That's right. And just to build on the point, Lord Evans yesterday, in a very articulate and very elegant way, described this process as bonkers. And I couldn't agree more with him about that. Members of the public often write to say ministers are also MPs, so why should they be different, and why should they be held to a different test, and why should there be different rules of transparency about what they register, what they don't register, and so on. And recently we had a number of MPs and a number of ministers who attended the same event. The MP has 28 days, not a month, 28 days to register their attendance, the value and the name of the donor of the hospitality. A minister is not subject to the same rules, even though they were at the same event. It seems really inconsistent.
The minister might have more responsibility for decision-making in that field.
Precisely. And that's the point that the public make. And it seems inconsistent to us and to the public. And we need to ensure that ministers are at least subject to the same scrutiny as backbench MPs when it comes to the registration and declaration of gifts, hospitality and so on.
Have you had any conversations with Lord Geit about trying to align?
I haven't spoken to Lord Guyte in recent weeks, but I'm confident that he would agree that there needs to be a greater consistency and proportionality, to use that word again, of how we register and how members declare hospitality and gifts, and that would apply to ministers too.
Anybody else on that? Alberto?
No, on the other points I've got to.
All right, yeah, feel free. Go on, Alberto.
Chair, I have got...
Oh, sorry, yes, you're quite right. I've written down
sorry.
Rita, and I've not called you out. Rita, and then I come to Alberto.
So I think something quite interesting to my eye happened in that exchange, because you confirmed to the chair the reasons why you didn't investigate wallpaper. One of the things I struggle with is as a member of the committee is reading about something or hearing in a newspaper or hearing about it on the media, and then myself not understanding why it doesn't find itself in investigation territory. So it could be because it's simply not within scope, and many of those cases are clear. But there are other cases where, if my dad asked me, are you looking at that then? Quite often I find myself saying, well, I don't know. And I know that you publish cases about which you are undertaking inquiries on the website, but there still feels to me to be a big grey area about, things that come to public attention but don't end up in the process. And quite often I don't understand why that is, and I'm slightly reluctant to kind of name examples, but I can think of a couple of examples in the last couple of months. So we had the stuff before Christmas about MPs in MPs' offices and what they were doing. Was it business or was it political campaigning? And and I'm just left with a bit of greyness in my own mind about some of those cases. Do you think there's room for you to say more about cases which I imagine have been the subject of complaints, but where you decide not to progress an investigation? It feels like a problematic area to me.
I feel like I'm saying the same word again. It's about proportionality. And we would be very happy to come to committee where there are cases that have concerned you or your dad about why we haven't investigated them and give a rationale for that. We'd be very, very happy to do that. We give an update to the committee every month. We receive far more cases that we don't investigate than cases that we do because they're out of scope or they're for a different one of the 13 bodies. But if there are cases in future, I'd be very, very happy to set out the rationale.
It's not just for me, though. I think it's for the public, where some things just kind of swill around for a long time, and it's just not clear that there was any consequence to the action reported. I mean, I understand there are difficulties about it, but it does feel like there's something unsatisfactory in the system. But thank you for that. Thank you.
But I think you were saying in relation to people using their offices, it was a matter of proportion.
Yes. Yes.
You thought it would be disproportionate to launch an investigation into whether people had used their offices inappropriately.
I think this is one of the challenges of an inconsistency that has arisen from the application of the rules on the use of parliamentary facilities. And it goes back to the point I made about wanting clarity about use of stationery. The rules as they are at the moment are very clear. There should be no use of parliamentary facilities for anything other than a parliamentary purpose. The committee has, in recent reports, said that there could be allowed to be a proportionate use. So there's a disconnect between what the committee has said and what is actually written in the rules. So one of the things that I hope to arrive at from the review of the Code of Conduct is a clarity about what proportionate means. What does proportionate use mean? Members of staff in the Houses of Parliament have a policy about reasonable use of technology. We're allowed to look at, check our bank statements or book a holiday or if only, do something like that in lunch times. Surely there should be something that enables MPs to have that as something that they can refer to. This was reasonable use. Whether or not that reasonable use should be for business purposes that you are being paid by an external organisation for, is something that, in my view, the public would feel very strongly about, and that is not why members of Parliament are elected and not what their parliamentary facilities are for.
Jane.
Just interested that when you were talking about the Ministerial Code and the wish to have the consistency across that and the Code of Conduct, you didn't make comment on whether you would wish to be able to investigate from a ministerial perspective, or whether actually it's still having a separate commissioner for that in Lord Geit, but just making sure that there's that consistency across the two. So I would welcome your thoughts on that.
And it's really interesting because I was thinking about that this morning, and one solution would be to have one register which meets the principle of openness, with allegations of breaches being investigated by the relevant body, whether that be the Independent Advisor on Ministerial Interests, the Electoral Commission, because the Electoral Commission have a locus in relation to donations, or my office.
Thank you.
I mean, one of the differences between yourself and Lord Geit is obviously it's a more nebulously appointed, and the powers are rather more nebulous. They're not in standing orders or in statute or anything, are they?
Hopefully that will change.
Alberto.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, Commissioner, and thank you very much for coming before the committee with your team. You heard the questions that I was asking yesterday, so I don't propose to go through the different roles that you've got, but it is about your role, in particular the way with which this committee interprets Standing Order 150 in terms of one of your principal duties to advise this committee. You've just said before this committee that you're independent, impartial, thorough and fair. Do you consider it fair and impartial that the MP is excluded from deliberations but you're present and able to answer questions?
I'd like to broaden out my answer, Mr. Costa, because I've thought very carefully about the questions you put to the other witnesses yesterday. And absolutely, I and my team are independent, impartial, thorough and fair. I also noted yesterday that you raised the question of whether or not the process follows the principles of natural justice. Absolutely it does. Members of Parliament are given adequate notice, they're given a fair hearing, and the investigation is carried out by someone without bias.
I'm asking, Commissioner, I'm asking...
Can I just finish my point?
Of course.
This isn't an adversarial system, it's an inquisitorial one. It's not a criminal process, it's a parliamentary process. My investigations and the resulting memoranda are always in line with the values that you've just very kindly set out. The memoranda are always sent to the committee before I attend, and I answer questions on the facts and the rules. To go to your point about the standing order. Standing Order 150, one of the elements of that is to advise this committee. In individual cases where there's been allegations of a breach of conduct and we've investigated it, we've looked at the allegation, we've looked at the evidence, we've analysed that evidence and we've come to a conclusion. That memorandum is sent to the committee. I have never, nor have any of my predecessors, been involved in any decision making about those cases, about upholding my decision or about any sanction. That's entirely for members of this committee. And I attend by invitation of the committee, so if the committee wanted to change that process, that would be in the committee's gift. And I'm confident that Sir Ernest Ryder will have some very helpful things to say about the process. And in recent times, in particular cases, I don't attend the oral evidence session for individual cases. I would be completely content for members of Parliament to hear my introductory remarks to memoranda, to hear my answers to questions that you put to me to test and to challenge the memoranda that we have But that's a matter for the committee, and we would be content to follow whatever process the committee determined.
Thank you. I asked a very specific question. Forgive me, Commissioner. I asked, do you think it fair and impartial for you to come during the deliberations of a case that you've presented to us when the MP is excluded? That was the question I asked.
I come at the invitation of the committee.
Do you consider it fair and impartial?
I come at the invitation of the committee.
Okay. You consider it compliant with Article 6 Convention rights, regardless of whether you're obliged to uphold those rights?
I think it's been tested, and the committee has been advised previously by Speaker's Council and others that the process is compliant with those rights, yes.
Thank you. In respect of Standing Order 149, the first duty of this committee, as explained in 149, is to oversee the work of the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards. It's entirely in keeping with select committees whose function is to scrutinise and oversee decision makers. But at 150, the principal duty of the Commissioner, at paragraph C, is to advise the committee in standards. Do you know of any other select committee here in the House of Commons where the select committee scrutinises a decision maker but is also advised by that decision maker?
I'm afraid I don't really have any knowledge of other select committees, Mr. Costa.
Do you know of any other public body that oversees the work of that public body but is also advised by that public body?
I wouldn't be able to answer that question.
One final question. Forgive me. It's to do with one of the recommendations, Commissioner. Recommendation, paragraph 13 on page 62, which we discussed earlier, Chairman, the recommendation to allow the Speaker to delegate an investigatory issue to you as the Commissioner. Can I ask, where did this recommendation originate from?
I'm afraid I can't answer that question.
I think it originated from me.
Okay.
And conversations with the Speaker's Council because of the change in the House of Lords.
Thank you. Did you have any correspondence or communication with the Speaker or his office about this recommendation?
No.
I did.
You did, thank you. And although you're not giving evidence, and one final question.
Well, I was just providing the answer, that's all.
As I don't recall getting any evidence from the Speaker requiring this power. Finally, we've heard about sexual harassment and bullying, and the doorkeepers have been used as an example of in an activity at the moment where you would not be able to investigate. Have you spoken to any doorkeepers about any sexual harassment or bullying that they feel they're unable to refer to you?
If I had, I wouldn't be discussing it at this committee.
Exactly.
Okay.
Sorry, Alberto, you're barking up an odd tree here.
No, most certainly not. I'm trying to get clarity on a recommendation here. My final question then is, would you advise this committee to get evidence from the Speaker and the doorkeepers on whether this recommendation is actually required?
I think that would be a matter for the Chair and the other committee members to decide.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Thank you.
Can I just say that the question on other public bodies where I certainly have that experience. So as Deputy Commissioner of London Fire Brigade, I both advised the authority and my work was scrutinised by the authority on an ongoing basis and in an annual set piece appraisal.
Great, thanks. Just one question that I do have in this kind of sphere, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, and I might very well be wrong here, but I think in IEP cases you have an investigator and then you are not the investigator, but you are the decision maker.
That's right.
In our cases, you are the investigator and the decision maker.
Members of the team investigate.
Right. Do you think that should change, or do you think you should move more to a structure like you have for IEP, or is that an irrelevant question?
It's not absolutely not an irrelevant question. I think if you're talking about a very clear separation within the office about the investigation and the decision, then that's something that we do have already. For code of conduct cases, we have some extremely knowledgeable, skilled, professional investigators from a range of different regulatory and legal backgrounds who report to Helen. They investigate allegations of the breach of the code of conduct. They investigate it, they write a memorandum, I consider it, and then, if necessary, we bring it to the committee. If we can rectify it, we rectify it at the less serious end of the spectrum.
Roughly how many rectifications do you do a year? Do you happen to know?
Around 30, I believe. I can double check it.
Okay, it'd be good just to have those facts.
Supplementary.
Yes, of course, Bernard.
I'm quite interested to hear about this separation of functions within your office, but it's not visible. The investigations are done in the name of the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards. Have you given any thought as to how that, because I think that separation, if it was more public, would be quite reassuring to those being investigated. What could we do to make that a more visible separation?
Perhaps we can think about some proposals and bring them back to you.
And it may be, of course, this is one of the elements that Sir Ernest Ryder will also be looking at, I guess. Yeah. Okay. Tammy.
James, this is for you, if that's okay. And just focusing on a little bit on some of the smaller changes to the registration, and I'm just interested in your opinion, really. So you'll see that we've talked about members registering and declaring a salary received from a political party or benefits they receive as a government trade envoy. And I just wondered what your thoughts are on this.
I think this speaks quite clearly to some of the recommendations that the Commission has made in her review of the code. I think if you start from the principle that the Register is there to shine a light on members' financial interests, then there is a logic to including things like the trade envoy, political parties. It would be a more complete register of members' financial interest. I mean, for example, overseas visits undertaken by individual members and APPGs are all registerable. So there's a certain logic to extending that, say, to trade envoys. Equally, there is a case for including salaries paid by to members by political parties. However, I think there are a couple of wider points that may be worth considering in terms of consistency. If you were to take, for example, salaries paid by political parties, would the committee also consider extending the category to donations, which at the moment the code says that you do not register donations from your own party organisation. If you were to link the salaries, would you want to link the donations as well?
The donations might, for instance, include if you go to a party conference or you go out campaigning, in a by-election and the party pays for your room. You don't have to declare that, do you?
That's correct. It says that you're not required to include in category 2 direct support to members from their own party organisation. And I think there may be a read across between that and salaries paid. Equally, if you're considering the parties, would the committee extend that to, say, short money allocated to individual members? It's another payment. It is part of parliamentary duties. I think the counterbalance to that, though, is paragraph 5, when it talks about the purpose of the register. It says the overall aim of registration and declaration is to provide information about any financial interest which might reasonably be thought by others to influence a member's actions, speeches or votes in Parliament. And given that an individual member is a member of a party, there is, is that link direct enough to say that you don't need to say that this would influence them, given that the money is already coming from the party to which they belong?
Jane first, yeah.
Sorry, it's not linked to this, it's
going
back earlier, so you might want to...
Well, Bernard then, and then I'll come back to
the reality is that any envoy or any paid MP from a political party is effectively added to the payroll. It means they can't rebel or they lose their position. shouldn't that be made plain on the register, that they are beholden to the government or the leader of their party with a financial or inducement or another inducement? I mean, some people might even consider it to be a kind of bribery. I think it's unconscionable. It's a way of extending the payroll vote without regard to the Ministerial and Other Salaries Act and the limitations on the number of ministers in the government.
Answer that, Jane.
I don't think I'm going to get into the inducement part of it, but I think it would be entirely consistent. Clearly, if we were to get to a position where ministers registered in the Register of Members' Financial Interests, which their benefits, they could do it in both, but I think consistency and clarity would be good. Their hospitality, clearly trade envoys would be part of that.
Trade envoys aren't.
I would say if you were to require ministers who are members to register not just in the government registers, but also in the Register of Members' Financial Interests, which the Commission has proposed, then clearly I would say trade envoys would also fit in that.
I just asked, does the Commissioner think these issues raise conflicts of interest that should be more transparent?
I think it's been fascinating listening to the witness evidence about transparency and conflicts of interest, and anything that influences a member's thoughts and words and actions, the purpose of the register. I think we should be thinking about how we record that so that it is transparent, not least for members of the public, to get a better view of, I think yesterday one of the witnesses said, he who pays the piper calls the tune. And, we need to think very, very carefully about how we represent the register and how we make sure that there is transparency.
Jane, let's go back to your thing.
So sorry, I want to go back to the investigation point that you made around the distinction between your team investigating and you making the decision. Because if I think about particularly the Owen Patterson case, that's not the impression that I was left with from that case, in the sense that we had quite a number of conversations about the number of times that you invited the MP to meet with you, the conversations that you had with him that I think were part of the report. So that distinction wasn't clear to me in that particular case. So I'm not sure that leaves me with a question, but maybe to Bernard's point, is that distinction is not clear to me in some of the evidence and the reports, etc., that this committee has received.
And I welcome the opportunity to clarify that. In the case of Mr. Patterson, I did, as you know, interview him on a number of occasions and had some extended correspondence with him myself. And it tends to be the case where allegations which we feel can be resolved by rectification are addressed by the team, and ones which require more extended investigation are ones which come through to Helen and to myself. So I'm sorry if...
So there's not the same clear distinction in standards cases as there is in the IEP cases.
No. Helen, do you want to?
So with the IEP cases, it's a completely independent investigator who's independent from Parliament, and whilst the Commissioner does have oversight of their work, it is done in a more sort of formalised, separate way.
Thank you, because it felt to me like from the previous conversation that they were the same, but they're not.
No, they're not.
Thank you.
Yeah. Michael, I think you wanted to come in on the back of what Bernard said.
Yes, it was on the back of the transparency, and it's a question for James, actually. We heard evidence yesterday about the level and quality of information that's available on the register. And I think one of the examples actually was, in your case, Bernard, about a name that was on someone, a constituent that had given you some money, and that's all it was a name. How quick a fix would it be to enhance the level of information available on the register? I suppose what I'm getting at is are MPs not required to do it, or is it a technological reason as to why it's not able to be done?
In terms of the example you gave, members are required to provide the address of private donors. It's just we do not publish them. It would be unfair to give the publish private addresses of individuals who make donations. So that sort of information is there. I think in terms of
How do you get that information? Oh, that was the question.
Pardon?
How do you get that information? Because the argument we heard was, well, all I saw was a name, and if you Google the name, you get a murder in America. So how do you enhance the levels of information available?
We get that information from the member. I mean, the member will supply both the name and the address of the private individual who has made a donation or has provided hospitality. We have a policy of just, so we retain that information in terms of the address, but we don't publish it, and I think for very good reason.
We've got 10 minutes, I'm afraid, so we're going to have to...
I think that slightly misses the point. So I don't think anybody's interested in the address of the constituent, but the fact that it was, as it were, just a constituent who is a friend, I think, was the thing that they were interested in, as against, you know, is it a local business person, for example? So there were more, I think what they were interested in yesterday was more the kind of status of the individual than where they live. And so if we wanted to address that point, I think Michael's question is a good one. How easy a fix is that?
I think they just wanted a better story to write for their newspapers.
Yes. But, sorry, it's the answer to the question, what is the nature of the relationship?
The question is how could you make it more transparent in a way that didn't lead you to endless rows every single day of the week about what counts as a proper reason? So you could do all of it. We could go online and do our own registration, couldn't we? Rather than send emails to you and have backwards and forwards. And there could be boxes, and you have to do. One of the boxes might be what was the purpose of this gift? It could be long-standing friend, or it could be business associate, or whatever. But devising that might not be simple. Is that the point?
No. We try to keep brevity at the heart of the register just because of the size of it, but there was, it would be an easy fix if you wanted to have a free text descriptor box under each entry that just gives further information. But that's, clearly very much something for the committee to make a decision on.
Okay.
That'd be quite positive.
I'm going to move us on, I'm afraid. Paul.
This is also to James, and it's around topical or supplementary questions, which arguably are longer than they used to be. Do you think members should be required to declare relevant interest during topical or supplementary questions?
It's an interesting question. For greater transparency, you'd want to say yes, but I think the guide to the rules does acknowledge that the balance needs to be struck between the transparency and the pressure on time.
But is there any transparency when somebody says, in any circumstance, I refer members to my entry in the register? That's not transparent at all. It's exactly the opposite of transparent. Nobody has the faintest idea what you're talking about.
No, it's a flag that's gone up that if you are, it then depends what follows in the question. And any journalist that listens to the question and knows that there's a flag up, they want to investigate, a member of the public. Sorry, I'm answering.
But members in the chamber then don't know. They don't know what it is, do they?
Well, I've got a Google app. I can.
You're not meant to be Googling in the chamber.
So James.
Sorry, James. This is a question to James.
James, what do you think?
No problem. I think there are two parts to this. The first is where members are required to make a declaration. Then yes, it should be succinct, but more informative than I refer you to my entry in the register. With topical questions and supplementary questions, I think you're slightly more complex. Supplementary questions should really be attached to your question that you have on the order paper, and there you are already required to make some sort of declaration and give details of what that declaration is to the table office. So it is slightly more, transparent. So the supplementary. Topical questions...
Not only if it's your own supplementary, not if you're asking a supplementary on the back of somebody else's.
Right. On that, you're
and
right.
I've never known the table office ask you what is the registrable interest that you're registering when you table the question.
Well, there is
never
a space
once.
for you to write it in.
I know, but yes, indeed. But I've never known them ask, and I'm not sure it's on the... and you certainly don't have to say what it is. You could argue that it should say what it is.
There is the ability to say what it is, both on the hard copy and on the Member Hub version.
Is there?
The question was, should they be required?
Very required. Supplementaries, topicals, I think, again are interesting, but you've got the pressure of time. Topicals, you have no advanced, you don't give the Minister advance notice of what the subject is, so it may be helpful to do it at that point in terms of transparency. I think the one thing I would caution on it, though, is that topical questions are pretty much the same formulation as engagements questions to the Prime Minister. Mm-hmm. And so, again, for consistency, if you applied it to topical questions, you should, you may have to apply it for PMQs, and that is where the pressure on time for members is at its highest.
Talking of which, it's always at my back I hear Time's Winged Chariot, Harry.
What about when you're in the division lobby?
Sorry.
Interest when you're casting a vote.
Sorry, Bernard. Rita was next.
It's a rhetorical question.
Yesterday, I think it was Henry Dyer said that he did not support our proposal that the registration of lobbying activities by family members should cease. As I recall, the motivation for our proposal was that family members should not be regarded, as it were, as the property of an MP, which is the implication of having to declare their lobbying activities. And Heather at the time told us that it was anyway rarely used. Do you have any views about that?
I think a decision on retaining or removing that category is very much one for the committee and not for me.
It's helpful.
Okay. Michael.
Thanks, Chair. Kathryn, I just want to echo, first of all, Alan's comments earlier about the work that you and your team do, and to thank you for it. I mean, I know the abuse that you guys suffered over the Owen Patterson case was outrageous, and the resilience that you showed is commendable, so thank you for that. One of the complaints that we have had, or one of the issues that we've heard through in listening to cases, is the length of time that it takes to get a case completed. What are the main issues in your view which affect the length of time to complete a case, and are there fixes in the short to medium term which can be done to try and change that?
Sure. So the key point when we're thinking about this is that we can't sacrifice quality, investigational rigour, fairness for speed. So
take that as a given.
Yeah. Having looked at the investigations that were started this year, the average length of time for an investigation is just over 2 months, so around 63 days. There are investigations that by their nature will take longer, so more complex allegations, a larger number of allegations. So the cases that are referred to the committee have normally taken a little longer, just because by their nature they are usually towards the more serious end of the spectrum. So this is one of the reasons that when a case does come before the committee, the Commissioner always provides a timeline which shows the progress of the investigation, and if there have been any delays, why there have been. So you can have unusual delays so that are unavoidable, for example, a member's personal circumstances, allowing them time to get advice or to the collection of further evidence.
Suppose it's avoidable delay we're looking at rather than...
So having looked through the cases, one of the biggest variables that will affect how long a case takes is the level of engagement from the member. So if a member gets the letter, reads the questions really carefully, provides full and adequate answers, responds promptly, the investigation will go more quickly. If, however, and it's not unusual for us to have to go back to a member, re-asking the same questions we've asked, or having to go back things over again, we do set deadlines. I think there can be a tendency for people to see that as dates to aim for rather than dates to respond by, and that can make it slower.
Right. We've got 3 minutes. Sorry.
Very briefly on this question.
No.
My
Mahmouda.
question, yeah. 3 minutes for one of the big questions that has taken up a lot of people's emotions over the last 1.5 days. Kathryn, you'll have been aware. So my question is in relation to second jobs and your views on our committee's proposals on MPs outside jobs, in particular the issues around reasonableness and rebuttable presumption.
Right.
In 3 minutes.
Gosh, in 2 minutes actually. At the moment, there is no prohibition on second jobs at all. And one of the things that has been repeated by a number of witnesses is that being a member of Parliament shouldn't be the second job. And there are a number of cases where being a member of Parliament is clearly the second job, given the amount of hours that are expended and the amount of money that's being received. in my view, the public expects the parliamentary work to be the first call on an MP's time, and members of the public tell us that day and daily. Whatever is proposed, for me, having listened to the discussions over the past couple of days, the conflict of interest point is really, really key. And at the moment, MPs register their outside work with the registrar. There is no regulation of what's registered. So if we're going to shift from a registration to a regulation and look at not just who and what, but why, to go to the journalist point from yesterday, obviously we're going to need more resources and more powers to do that. And I think we also need to think very carefully, Mahmouda, to go to your point about, to go to the points about transparency. Contracts are also going to be key to that. Chair, I've probably got 1 minute left. May I do my any other business point?
Well, I don't know whether you wanted to talk about parliamentary facilities. Is that what you wanted to talk about?
I think I've already talked about parliamentary facilities a little bit by saying...
What's your any other business then?
My any other business is, firstly, to say thank you to this committee for the care and for the consideration that you give to the cases that we bring to you. I know these cases are very difficult and they can be very challenging personally, so thank you for the care and the consideration that you give to those cases. And just to pick up on Michael's point, I'd also like to say thank you to my team, who have been through some very, very difficult, challenging times of late and have weathered those storms with incredible professionalism and resilience. So I'd like to say thank you to them. My final point is, this work matters, standards matter.
I'm very grateful to you. We are grateful to you for the work that you do, and we have been painfully conscious, I think, in particular over the last 18 months, how difficult that has been, not partly because of COVID, but also because of some of the sustained campaigns that have been run, and some of the questioning of the very existence of why we have standards committees and standards commissioners and all the rest of it. I think I'm always conscious that when people say standards don't matter, it just sounds to me like an excuse for bad behaviour, and I don't think anybody on this committee accepts that. I think it would be really useful if you could write to us about the resources you presently have and the resources that you might need if any of the things that we're suggesting need to change, because we would want to proceed on the basis of making sure you've got the resources to do the job, rather than telling you to do a job that for which we haven't got the resources.
No, that's not for now.
All right. Order. Thank you very much.
Well done.